I spent 70 years living the wrong way, until I saw the truth. The emotional trap we all fall into does not feel like a trap at first. It feels like love, like responsibility, like maturity. It feels like choosing peace over conflict and patience over desire. It feels like being the reasonable one in a world full of noise. I did not recognize it as a trap until I was already old enough to know better and tired enough to stop pretending. By then, it had quietly shaped my entire life. I am 71 years old now. People say that as if it explains everything, as if age itself is the reason for reflection and regret. But the truth is simpler and harder. I am thinking about my life now because I finally stopped running from it. Slowing down did what busyness never allowed. It removed the distractions. It gave my thoughts room to breathe. And in that quiet, the truth surfaced whether I wanted it to or not. The truth was this. I spent most of my life believing that if I managed my emotions well enough, if I stayed calm, understanding, and forgiving, everything would work out. I believed that swallowing disappointment was a sign of strength. I believed that wanting less made me wiser. I believed that love meant adjusting myself until no one else had to. That belief was praised everywhere I went. It made me dependable. It made me likable. It made me invisible. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I have been described as kind, patient, grounded, and easy to be around. I have also been lonely, resentful, exhausted, and quietly angry for reasons I could never fully explain until recently. Those two realities existed side by side for decades. One was public, one was private. I lived in the space between them and called it normal. I grew up learning the rules early. Don't overreact. Don't be dramatic. Don't make things harder than they need to be. My mother lived by those rules, and so did the women around her. Emotional restraint was admired. Emotional honesty was tolerated only in small doses. I learned quickly that the safest way to be loved was to be manageable. That lesson followed me into adulthood without resistance. When I married Thomas at 24, I believed I was choosing stability. He was kind in predictable ways. He worked hard. He did not raise his voice. He did not embarrass me. He was steady, and I mistook that steadiness for emotional safety. When I felt unsure, when I sensed that something was missing, I told myself those feelings were immature. I believed that adults did not expect fulfillment. They expected endurance. The emotional trap began there. Though I did not know it yet, every time I felt disappointed and told myself it was not worth addressing, the trap tightened slightly. Every time I felt hurt and explained it away, the walls grew higher. I became very good at rationalizing my own unhappiness. I told myself everyone felt this way. I told myself marriage was not supposed to be exciting. I told myself wanting more was selfish. Children arrived, and with them came purpose that felt undeniable. Motherhood gave me a socially approved reason to put myself last. I did it willingly and well. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. I learned to smooth over conflicts, to translate emotions, to keep everything running. People relied on me. They admired me. I took pride in being the emotional center that never collapsed. But something subtle was happening beneath the surface. I was not just managing emotions, I was suppressing them. I was teaching myself that discomfort was a personal failure. I was convincing myself that if I could just be more understanding, more flexible, more patient, the emptiness would disappear. It never did. It just learned how to hide. There were moments when I almost noticed, sitting alone in the car after errands, feeling a heaviness I could not name, standing in the kitchen late at night, wondering when I had last felt truly seen, listening to friends complain about their lives and realizing I had nothing honest to say in return. Each time I pushed the feeling away. I had responsibilities. I had gratitude. I had no right to be unhappy. That is the trap. It convinces you that emotional pain must be justified to be real. It teaches you to rank your suffering against others until yours seems unworthy of attention. I became fluent in that language. I spoke it to myself daily. Other people have it worse. You should be thankful. This is just how life is. Those phrases kept me functional and quietly miserable. As the years passed, I noticed that my reactions grew smaller. I stopped getting excited. I stopped getting angry. I stopped expecting anything emotionally nourishing. I told myself this was maturity. In truth, it was resignation. I had mistaken emotional numbness for peace. I had fallen into the trap completely, mistaking survival for success. Thomas and I lived side by side for decades. We were polite. We were cooperative. We were distant in ways that were easy to ignore because nothing was obviously wrong. That made it harder to justify my sadness. There was no betrayal, no cruelty, no dramatic failure. There was only absence, and absence, when it is quiet, is easy to dismiss. When Thomas became ill, I stepped into the caretaker role without hesitation. I was praised again for my strength. I accepted the praise because it felt familiar. Caring for him gave me something to focus on. It postponed the reckoning with myself. When he died, I grieved sincerely. But beneath that grief was something I was ashamed to acknowledge. Relief. Not relief that he was gone, but relief that he was gone, but the relief that the waiting was over. Widowhood changed the shape of my days, but not the core of my struggle. I was alone now, truly alone, and there was no one left to manage but myself. That is when the trap began to reveal itself. Without constant emotional labor, I felt exposed. The feelings I had avoided for years surfaced without warning. Regret, anger, sadness, questions I could no longer silence with busyness. At 68, I realized I did not know myself very well. I knew how to be useful. I knew how to be calm. I knew how to be reasonable. I did not know what I wanted. I did not know what made me feel alive. I had spent so long managing emotions that I had forgotten how to experience them honestly. The emotional trap had taught me that strong women do not need much. That belief had shaped every decision I made. It kept me from speaking up. It kept me from leaving. It kept me from asking for more when I still had time. I saw now how quietly devastating that belief had been. It did not destroy my life all at once. It eroded it patiently year by year. I do not tell this story to blame anyone. I participated in my own disappearance. I believed the lies because they made life easier in the short term. They helped me avoid conflict. They helped me belong, but they cost me intimacy with myself. That cost did not show up on the surface. It showed up in the way my life felt when no one was watching. Now, in the quiet of my later years, I see the trap clearly. It is the belief that managing emotions is the same as honoring them. It is the idea that calm is always healthier than honesty. It is the comfort of being needed instead of being known. Many people fall into it. Few recognize it while there is still time. I am learning, late in life, that emotional truth does not destroy relationships nearly as often as silence destroys the self. I am learning that peace built on suppression is fragile. I am learning that it was never selfish to want more. It was human. This is not a story of reinvention. It is a story of recognition. Of finally seeing the pattern that shaped my life and naming it without excuses. The trap caught me because I thought it was safety. Understanding that does not change the past, but it changes how I carry it. I woke up the morning after my 71st birthday with a strange sense of urgency. The kind that doesn't come from panic, but from clarity. Nothing dramatic had happened the day before. There was a small cake, a few phone calls, polite smiles, the familiar phrases about being blessed and strong and aging gracefully. I thanked everyone. I meant it. And yet when I was alone again, sitting at the edge of my bed with the early light slipping through the curtains, a thought settled into me with a weight I could not ignore. If I don't confront this now, I never will. That was when I began to look backward, not with nostalgia or bitterness, but with precision. I wanted to understand exactly how the emotional trap had shaped me, not in abstract ideas, but in moments, habits, and choices. I wanted to trace its fingerprints across my life. The first thing I noticed was how often I had dismissed my own reactions. When Thomas and I were newly married, I remember a night when he canceled dinner plans without telling me. I had cooked for hours. The table was set. I waited, growing colder and more embarrassed by the minute. When he finally came home late and distracted, apologizing casually, I smiled and said it was fine. I told myself it truly was fine. But that night, lying awake beside him, I felt a small fracture open inside me. I did not name it. I told myself love meant flexibility. That was the first time I chose emotional silence over truth. Those choices accumulated. They became reflexive. Whenever something hurt, I translated it into something acceptable. Hurt became understanding. Disappointment became maturity. Anger became patience. Over time, I stopped trusting my emotional responses altogether. If I felt something strongly, I assumed it meant I was being unreasonable. That assumption guided me more than any external rule ever did. I see now how that belief affected my friendships too. I was the listener, the steady one, the woman people came to when they needed perspective. I rarely shared my own struggles, not because I had none, but because I believed mine were less valid. When friends asked how I was doing, I answered honestly but incompletely. I learned how to sound open without being vulnerable. I learned how to reveal facts without revealing feelings. The emotional trap thrives in that space. It rewards composure and punishes honesty with discomfort. Every time I chose the path of least resistance, I reinforced it. People grew accustomed to my calm. They expected it, and I delivered, even when it cost me. Motherhood intensified everything. I loved my children deeply, but I also disappeared inside that role. Every sacrifice was praised. Every boundary I erased was framed as devotion. When I felt overwhelmed or invisible, I told myself that good mothers did not complain. I taught my children kindness and empathy, but I never taught them how to see me as a full person. That omission was not their fault, it was mine. As my children grew older and more independent, the emptiness I had avoided became harder to ignore. I filled it with routine, volunteering, obligation. I stayed busy so I would not have to listen to myself. Looking back, I understand that busyness was not productivity, it was avoidance. The hardest realization came when I acknowledged how little I expected from my marriage by the end. Not because I didn't deserve more, but because I had trained myself not to want it. Emotional hunger, when ignored long enough, dulls. I mistook that dullness for acceptance. I mistook emotional distance for peace. After Thomas died, people assumed my grief would define this chapter of my life. In some ways, it did. But beneath the grief was a quieter reckoning. Without anyone else's needs to manage, I had no distraction left. The emotional trap no longer had anything to hide behind. I felt exposed to myself in ways that were deeply uncomfortable. I started journaling, not to document my days but to listen. I wrote without censoring, without softening. At first, what came out was messy and contradictory. Anger alongside gratitude, regret alongside love. I realized how much of my emotional life I had edited in real time for decades. Seeing it unfiltered was unsettling and freeing all at once. One afternoon, while reading back over my own words, I saw a pattern that made my chest tighten. Nearly every entry included some version of the same sentence. I should have said something. That realization hurt more than any single regret. It revealed how consistently I had abandoned myself in the name of harmony. The emotional trap does not require cruelty or neglect from others to work. It only requires cooperation. It relies on the belief that emotional discomfort is dangerous and must be neutralized quickly. I had believed that for most of my life. I had treated my own emotions as problems to solve instead of messages to hear. As I sit with this understanding now, I do not feel consumed by regret. I feel sober, clear. The past cannot be rewritten, but it can be understood honestly. That understanding does not erase the pain, but it gives it meaning. I am learning, even now, to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to smooth it over. I am learning that emotional truth does not require justification, it only requires courage. This lesson comes late, but it comes with depth. There is a moment that comes late in life when you realize that understanding something does not immediately free you from it. Awareness is not release. Seeing the emotional trap clearly did not undo decades of conditioning. It simply removed my ability to lie to myself about it. That was both a gift and a burden. After the journaling began, after the patterns became undeniable, I entered a strange emotional season. I was no longer numb, but I was not yet healed. I felt everything more sharply. Small memories carried disproportionate weight. A phrase someone once said to me, a choice I barely remembered making. A silence I had defended for years, all of it resurfaced with clarity that felt almost cruel. I remember one evening sitting alone in my living room, the television off, the house too quiet. The thought arrived without drama. This is the most honest I have ever been with myself, and I have never felt more exposed. For most of my life, I had equated emotional control with safety. Now, without that armor, I felt vulnerable in a way I had avoided since youth. I began noticing how often I still tried to manage my emotions instead of allowing them. When sadness rose, my instinct was to analyze it, to contextualize it, to soften it. When anger appeared, I questioned whether it was justified. Even in self-reflection, I was negotiating with my feelings instead of listening to them. The trap had not disappeared, it had simply changed form. What surprised me most was how deeply the fear of being too much still lived in me. I was 71 years old, living alone, accountable to no one, and still, I hesitated to fully feel. That hesitation revealed the real damage of the emotional trap. It does not just shape relationships, it reshapes identity. It teaches you to see yourself as a potential burden. I thought back to my younger self, the woman who believed that love was earned through emotional restraint. I did not feel anger toward her. I felt tenderness. She had done what she knew to survive. But survival is not the same as living, and confusing the two cost her more than she ever realized. One day, while visiting my daughter, I caught myself minimizing a feeling out loud. She had asked how I was really doing, and I responded with a version of the truth that felt safe. Halfway through my sentence, I stopped. Something in me refused to continue the performance. I took a breath and said, quietly, I think I spent my life being strong instead of being honest, and I don't know how to undo that. The room fell silent. My daughter looked at me not with discomfort, but with recognition. In that moment, I understood something important. The emotional trap had convinced me that honesty would create distance. In reality, it had been my silence that kept people from knowing me. That realization hurt, but it also opened a door I did not know still existed. We talked for a long time that day. Not dramatically, not tearfully, just honestly. I did not blame. I did not accuse. I simply spoke without editing myself for comfort. When I left her house later, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I had finally spoken. Heavier because I understood how rarely I had allowed myself to do so. That experience changed something subtle but important. I began testing honesty in small ways. I allowed myself to admit when I was lonely without apologizing for it. I allowed myself to say no without explaining. I allowed myself to feel disappointment without immediately forgiving it away. Each act felt unfamiliar, almost rebellious, but none of them destroyed anything. That was the most surprising part. The emotional trap thrives on imagined consequences. It tells you that truth will break what silence has preserved. But silence does not preserve. It delays decay until it becomes internal. I had carried that decay quietly for decades. Speaking did not make it worse, it gave it air. I still wrestle with regret. There are moments when I wish I had understood all this sooner, when the cost of change would have been lower. But regret, I am learning, does not have to be a punishment. It can be a teacher. It can show you what matters without trapping you in what cannot be changed. If there is one lesson my life now makes clear, it is this. Emotional restraint is not wisdom when it comes at the cost of self-abandonment. Strength is not measured by how little you need. It is measured by how honestly you allow yourself to exist. I am not rewriting my life. I am finally reading it accurately. That alone has changed the way I inhabit the days I have left. When you stop living inside the emotional trap, even briefly, you begin to notice how deeply it shaped the smallest details of your life. It is not only in the big choices, marriage, motherhood, sacrifice, but in the everyday posture you take toward the world. The way you answer questions, the way you soften your tone before speaking, the way you prepare yourself to be misunderstood before anyone has even responded. I started noticing those things in myself with an almost clinical awareness, as if I were observing a woman I had known for decades but never truly studied. One afternoon, standing in line at a grocery store, the cashier snapped at me over something trivial. The old version of me would have smiled apologetically, taken responsibility for nothing, and walked away with a familiar tightness in my chest. This time, something different happened. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her. I simply said calmly, "That wasn't necessary." The words surprised both of us. They surprised me most of all. My heart raced, waiting for the punishment I'd been conditioned to expect. None came. The world did not collapse. The moment passed. I walked to my car shaking, not from fear, but from realization. That small exchange revealed how much of my life had been governed by anticipation of conflict rather than actual conflict. I had spent years preparing myself emotionally for reactions that often never occurred. The trap had taught me to preemptively surrender my ground to avoid imagined harm. That habit had followed me everywhere, convincing me that peace required constant self-erasure. As I reflected more deeply, I saw how this pattern had shaped my sense of worth. I did not measure my value by what I felt or needed, but by how smoothly I could move through other people's lives. I felt most successful when I caused no disruption. That belief had been reinforced countless times. People thanked me for being understanding, flexible, low maintenance. Rarely did anyone thank me for being honest, because honesty was something I had learned to withhold. The emotional trap thrives on praise. It rewards you just enough to keep you compliant. I had been rewarded all my life for being easy to love. No one ever asked whether I felt loved. That distinction feels painfully obvious now, but it was invisible to me for years. There were moments, especially at night, when grief returned with a different texture. Not grief for Thomas alone, but grief for the woman I had been before I learned to disappear so efficiently. I mourned the version of myself that might have spoken sooner, wanted more openly, demanded emotional reciprocity instead of quietly compensating for its absence. That mourning did not feel dramatic. It felt slow and heavy, like carrying something fragile across a long distance. I also began to see how the emotional trap had affected my relationship with time. I had always believed there would be a later moment to address my needs. Later, when things were calmer. Later, when others were settled. Later, when it felt appropriate. That later had stretched across decades until it finally arrived as now. The realization that I had postponed myself for most of my life was difficult to accept without bitterness. I had to work consciously to replace blame with responsibility. I had made those choices. I had believed those stories. Understanding that gave me power. But it also demanded accountability. Some days, the clarity felt empowering. Other days, it felt unbearable. There were mornings when I woke up angry not at anyone in particular, but at the enormity of what had been lost quietly. I let myself feel that anger instead of neutralizing it. I let it exist without turning it into guilt. That was new. Anger, I discovered, is not inherently destructive. Suppressed anger is. I noticed changes in how I spoke, even when I was alone. I stopped narrating my feelings as if they needed justification. I stopped correcting myself mid-thought. I allowed sentences to finish. That may sound insignificant, but for someone who had spent a lifetime editing herself, it felt revolutionary. The emotional trap had convinced me that restraint was moral and expression was indulgent. Undoing that belief required more than insight. It required practice. It required tolerating discomfort. It required letting people see parts of me that had been hidden, not because they were shameful, but because they were inconvenient. I am still learning. I still catch myself retreating when emotions rise too quickly. Old habits do not disappear simply because you recognize them. But recognition changes the stakes. I no longer confuse silence with virtue. I no longer equate emotional endurance with love. What I understand now, at this late stage of life, is that the trap was never about emotions themselves. It was about permission. I never gave myself permission to take up emotional space. I waited for circumstances, roles, and approval that never came. Giving myself that permission now does not rewrite my past, but it reshapes my present in quiet, meaningful ways. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from calm, but from alignment. From no longer betraying yourself in small, daily ways. I am beginning to taste that peace. It is unfamiliar, sometimes uncomfortable, but unmistakably real. By the time I reached this stage of understanding, something unexpected happened. The emotional trap did not loosen its grip all at once. It fought back. Not dramatically, but subtly, the way old habits do when they sense they are losing control. I began to feel guilt for my honesty, guilt for my anger, guilt for the space I was starting to occupy. It was as if an internal voice kept asking, "Who do you think you are to change now?" That voice had been with me for most of my life. I had mistaken it for conscience. I now recognize it as conditioning. There were days when I questioned whether this late awakening was worth the discomfort it caused. I had lived so long inside emotional restraint that stepping outside it felt destabilizing. I wondered if peace, even a false one, had been better than this raw clarity. Those doubts were strongest when old memories surfaced with fresh intensity. One memory, in particular, refused to stay buried. I was 38, sitting across from Thomas at the kitchen table late at night. The children were asleep. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say for weeks. I remember gripping my mug so tightly my hands hurt. I told him, carefully, that I felt lonely even when we were together. I said it calmly, reasonably, exactly the way a woman trained not to cause trouble would say such a thing. He listened. He nodded. And then he said, "I don't know what you want me to do about that." That was the moment I retreated. Not because he was cruel, but because I interpreted his confusion as evidence that my feelings were unreasonable. I apologized for bringing it up. I told him I was tired. I never raised the subject again. That night became a turning point I did not recognize until decades later. It was when I learned that emotional needs without immediate solutions were liabilities. So I stopped presenting them. Revisiting that memory now, I felt grief not just for the moment, but for the conclusion I drew from it. I had mistaken his limitation for my failure. The emotional trap thrives on that misinterpretation. It convinces you that unmet needs are proof you should need less. As these realizations deepened, I noticed how differently I related to my body. For years, I had ignored physical signals the same way I ignored emotional ones. Fatigue was something to push through, tension was normal, discomfort was expected. Now I began paying attention. I rested when I was tired. I acknowledged pain instead of dismissing it. That shift felt connected to everything else. My body had learned the same lesson as my emotions: endure quietly. I also began to understand how generational this trap was. My mother had lived it. Her mother before her. Women praised for resilience, admired for sacrifice, rarely asked what it cost them. I had inherited that legacy without question. Recognizing it did not absolve me of responsibility, but it softened the blame I had been carrying. I was not uniquely weak for falling into the trap. I had been trained for it. This understanding brought compassion, but it also brought anger. Anger at the systems that rewarded silence. Anger at the narratives that framed self-denial as virtue. I allowed myself to feel that anger without trying to convert it into something more palatable. That alone felt like a quiet rebellion. There were moments of joy too, though they arrived unexpectedly and without ceremony. A walk taken slowly, without purpose. A conversation where I did not edit myself for likability. An afternoon spent reading without guilt. These moments did not feel euphoric. They felt grounded, real. They were small proofs that life could still expand, even now. I began to see my past not as a series of failures, but as a long negotiation between who I was and who I was allowed to be. For most of my life, I chose permission over authenticity. Now, with time shorter and clearer, I was choosing differently, not dramatically, quietly, intentionally. The emotional trap had promised safety, but delivered containment. Stepping out of it did not make life easier, it made it truer. That truth sometimes hurt, but it no longer hollowed me out. Pain acknowledged passed through me. Pain suppressed stayed. I did not pretend that this awareness arrived early enough to change everything. It did not. There are losses that cannot be recovered, years that cannot be relived, words that will never be spoken to people who are gone. I carry that knowledge without romanticizing it. Acceptance does not mean approval, it means honesty. What I know now is this: the most damaging emotional trap is the belief that it is too late to matter. I believed that for far too long. I no longer do. The time I have left deserves my presence, not my silence. This chapter of my life is not about becoming someone new. It is about finally allowing myself to be someone at all. There's a particular loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from realizing how long you lived without being fully present in your own life. As part of me continued to wake up, that loneliness deepened before it softened. I had expected clarity to bring relief. Instead, it brought a period of emotional turbulence I had never experienced before, because I had never allowed myself to experience it. For most of my life, emotions arrived and were immediately managed. Now they arrived and stayed. Grief lingered longer than I wanted it to. Anger surprised me with its intensity. Even joy felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, as if I didn't quite trust it yet. I realized how deeply I had associated emotional intensity with danger. Feeling deeply had always meant risk. Risk of conflict, risk of rejection, risk of being seen as difficult. Without that constant suppression, my inner world felt loud. I began to understand why so many people avoid this stage. Awakening does not feel graceful, it feels destabilizing. There were mornings I woke up already exhausted, not from activity, but from feeling. I questioned whether this emotional openness was sustainable. I wondered if I had opened something that should have remained closed. But slowly, something else emerged alongside the discomfort: integrity. For the first time, my inner experience matched my outer life more closely. I was no longer presenting a softened version of myself to the world while privately carrying a different truth. That alignment, even when painful, felt solid. Real. I noticed the shift most clearly in my relationships. Some people responded with curiosity and warmth, others with confusion. A few with quiet resistance. I did not dramatize these changes. I simply observed them. The emotional trap had taught me to measure my worth by how easily I fit into others' expectations. Now I was watching what happened when I stopped adjusting myself so quickly. What happened was revealing. Some connections grew deeper. Conversations slowed down. Silence became less tense. I spoke less but more honestly. I listened without immediately taking responsibility for other people's emotions. That boundary was new and uncomfortable but necessary. I was learning that empathy did not require self-erasure. Other relationships faded, not with conflict, but with distance. I felt sadness about that, but not regret. Those connections had relied on a version of me that no longer existed. Letting them go felt like acknowledging a truth rather than creating a loss. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I came across letters I had written to myself years ago and never sent to no one, really. They were written during moments of private overwhelm. Reading them now, I was struck by how consistently I had minimized my own pain even in private. Phrases like, "It's probably nothing," and "I shouldn't feel this way," appeared again and again. I had policed myself even when no one else was watching. That realization broke something open in me. I cried that day in a way I never had before, not quietly, not politely. I cried without trying to stop, without explaining, without correcting the feeling. It was not dramatic. It was necessary. When it passed, I felt emptied and grounded at the same time, as if something old had finally been released instead of carried forward. The emotional trap had not only shaped how I related to others, it had shaped how I treated myself in moments of vulnerability. I had been both the prisoner and the guard. Recognizing the dual role was painful, but it gave me a choice I had never fully claimed before. I began practicing something radical for me, self-permission. Permission to feel without justification. Permission to rest without earning it. Permission to speak without rehearsing. These permissions were small, almost invisible from the outside, but internally they changed everything. I also stopped romanticizing endurance. For years I had admired my ability to survive quietly. Now, I saw survival for what it was, a response to limitation, not a measure of fulfillment. I honored the strength it took, but I refused to confuse it with the life I deserved. As my days grew quieter, I noticed a different relationship with time. I no longer rushed through moments to get to the next responsibility. I allowed pauses. I allowed myself to sit without purpose. That stillness felt unsettling at first. It forced me to confront the reality of my life as it was, not as it had been defined by roles. In that stillness, I began to sense something I had not felt in decades. Choice. Not dramatic choice, not life-altering decisions, but the daily choice to remain present instead of numbing, to respond instead of retreating, to honor myself without waiting for permission from circumstances that would never arrive. I cannot undo the years I spent inside the emotional trap, but I can refuse to extend it into the years I have left. That refusal is not loud. It does not announce itself. It shows up quietly, in how I speak, how I rest, how I feel without apology. This stage of life has taught me something essential. Freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of self-betrayal. And for the first time, I am learning how to live without betraying myself. As the days passed, something settled inside me that I had never experienced before. A quiet authority over my own inner life. Not control, not suppression, but ownership. I no longer felt like a guest inside my own emotions. I was finally home, even if the house was unfamiliar and still a little messy. This shift did not come with applause or external validation. In fact, very few people noticed it at all. And that, I realized, was part of the lesson. I had spent most of my life believing that change only mattered if it was seen, acknowledged, or approved by others. Now I was learning that the most important transformations happen without witnesses. I began to revisit old memories, not to relive them, but to reinterpret them with the clarity I had never allowed myself before. Moments I had labeled as personal failures revealed themselves as moments of self-abandonment driven by fear. Fear of being too emotional. Fear of asking for more. fear of disrupting the fragile balance I had built my life around. There was a particular memory from my early 40s that returned often. I had been offered a chance to take a position that would have required relocating for a few years. It was not a dream job, but it was mine. I remember feeling a flicker of excitement followed almost immediately by guilt. What about Thomas's routine? What about the children's stability? What about being realistic? I declined the offer without much discussion. At the time, I told myself it was a mature decision. Now, I see it as another quiet concession made without ever asking whether I was allowed to want something that complicated other people's lives. The emotional trap had taught me that wanting was dangerous, that desire disrupted harmony, that fulfillment was optional, but responsibility was not. I had internalized those beliefs so deeply that I no longer recognized them as beliefs. They felt like facts. Letting go of them now did not make me reckless or selfish, it made me honest. And honesty, I discovered, carries its own kind of discipline. It requires you to sit with truths that are not flattering. It requires you to acknowledge how often you chose comfort over courage, but it also allows you to stop pretending that the cost was invisible. I began to speak differently to myself about my past. Instead of asking, "Why didn't you fight harder?" I asked, "What were you afraid would happen if you did?" That question changed everything. It replaced judgment with understanding. And understanding softened the shame that had lingered long after the moments themselves had passed. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the light fade, I felt a deep sense of sadness, not sharp, not overwhelming, but wide. It was the sadness of recognizing how much of life is shaped not by dramatic mistakes, but by quiet decisions made repeatedly. Decisions to stay silent, to adapt, to endure. The emotional trap thrives on repetition. It does not need crisis, it only needs time. I let that sadness exist without trying to transform it into gratitude or perspective. I did not tell myself it made me stronger. I did not search for a lesson immediately. I simply let it be what it was. That alone felt like progress. What surprised me was how this honesty began to change my relationship with hope. For most of my life, hope had been tied to circumstances changing, to other people becoming more attentive, to timing improving, to permission being granted. Now, hope felt quieter and more grounded. It was no longer about outcomes. It was about presence. I started doing things without explaining them, taking walks at odd hours, declining invitations without elaborate reasons, sitting in silence without filling it with productivity. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of alignment. Small signals to myself that I no longer needed to justify my existence. The emotional trap had convinced me that value came from usefulness. I had been useful in every role I occupied: wife, mother, friend, caretaker, listener. What I had rarely been was simply myself without function. Learning to exist without performing felt uncomfortable at first, like stepping onto unstable ground. But the ground held. There were still moments when the old reflexes returned, when I felt the urge to apologize for my feelings, when I minimized my needs out of habit. But now those moments stood out. I noticed them, and noticing created space to choose differently. I am aware that many people never reach this stage, not because they are incapable, but because the trap is convincing. It disguises itself as virtue. It is praised. It is roju. It is rewarded, especially in women of my generation. We were taught that being emotionally contained was a form of grace. No one warned us what it would cost. If there is any wisdom I carry now, it is this: emotional honesty does not make life easier, but it makes it real. And reality, even when painful, is less exhausting than pretending. I do not feel cheated by my life. I feel informed by it. I see now how the trap shaped me, and I choose every day not to step back into it. That choice is not dramatic. It is steady. It shows up in quiet moments when no one is watching. This chapter of my life is not about reclaiming what was lost. It is about refusing to lose anything more. There comes a point when reflection turns into responsibility. Not responsibility for the past that belongs to memory, but responsibility for how you live with what you now know. I felt that shift quietly, without ceremony. It arrived one morning as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair, looking at a face that carried both softness and endurance. I realized I was no longer asking, "Why did this happen to me?" I was asking, what will I do with this understanding now? That question changed the tone of my days. For the first time, I stopped measuring my life by what it had lacked and began measuring it by how honestly I was inhabiting it. This was not optimism, it was accuracy. I had spent too many years rewriting reality to make it tolerable. I had no interest in doing that anymore. One of the most difficult things to accept was that the emotional trap had not only limited my pain, it had limited my joy. I had believed for so long that emotional restraint protected me from suffering. What I had not understood was that it also muted delight. You cannot selectively numb emotions. When you quiet grief, you quiet wonder too. When you suppress anger, you dull passion. I had lived a carefully moderated life, and now I could finally see the full cost of that moderation. Joy began to return in unfamiliar forms. Not excitement, not thrill, but moments of quiet rightness. A conversation where I spoke freely and felt heard. An afternoon spent doing nothing without guilt. A laugh that surprised me with its ease. These moments felt fragile at first, as if they might disappear if I acknowledged them too loudly. I learned to let them exist without clinging. There was also a new honesty in how I remembered Thomas. I no longer needed to idealize him or diminish myself to make sense of our marriage. I could hold the full truth, that we cared for each other, that we failed each other emotionally, and that neither of us knew how to name what was missing. That clarity did not make the past heavier. It made it lighter. It freed me from narratives that had kept me stuck in quiet self-blame. I began speaking differently about my life when people asked. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, simply with truth. When someone said, "You must be proud of how strong you've been," I no longer nodded automatically. Sometimes I said, "I survived, but I wish I had known sooner that I didn't have to do it quietly." Those words felt risky the first few times. Then they felt natural. What surprised me most was how often others responded with relief, as if my honesty gave them permission to acknowledge their own unspoken feelings. I realized then that the emotional trap is rarely a solitary experience. It is reinforced socially. When one person breaks the pattern even gently, it disrupts something larger than themselves. I also stopped treating my age as a limitation. For years, I had unconsciously believed that growth belonged to the young, that at my stage of life, reflection was acceptable but change was unnecessary. That belief dissolved as I practiced living differently. Change did not require reinvention. It required intention, and intention does not expire with age. There were days when sadness returned unexpectedly, when I felt the weight of years I could not reclaim. I did not argue with that sadness anymore. I let it sit beside me. I learned that grief does not need resolution to be respected. It only needs acknowledgement. In that acknowledgement, it softened. I think often about the version of myself who believed endurance was the highest form of love. I no longer judge her. I honor her for getting me here. But I do not let her make my decisions anymore. The emotional trap may have shaped most of my life, but it does not get to shape the rest of it. What I live now is quieter than what I imagined fulfillment would look like when I was younger. There is no grand transformation, no dramatic arc. There is just honesty, practiced daily. And that honesty has brought a sense of wholeness I did not know was possible. If there is one truth my life now stands as evidence for, it is this. It is never too late to stop abandoning yourself. The cost of awareness is discomfort. The reward is dignity. And dignity, I have learned, is not given by others. It is claimed. Even now, at 71, I sometimes wake in the early hours and feel the weight of my own history. But it is no longer the suffocating weight of silence, nor the quiet obedience that defined so many decades. It is the weight of knowing, of finally understanding the shape of my own life and, most importantly, recognizing what I have the power to do with the time I still have. I see now that the emotional trap was never about other people. It was about the rules I had absorbed, the lessons I had accepted without question, and the belief that my feelings were secondary. Every act of endurance, every small concession, every avoided confrontation had been a layer of self-denial. And though it cost me dearly, I also see that awareness itself is a gift. I make decisions differently now. I do not seek drama, but I do seek truth. I do not demand change from the world, but I refuse to edit myself for its comfort. I let my feelings exist, unshaped by expectation. I rest when I am tired, I speak when I am ready, And I forgive myself for the decades I spent quietly surviving instead of truly living. The relationships I have now are quieter but more meaningful. I invest in people who can witness me without judgment. I speak my truth even when it risks discomfort. I allow emotions to flow without editing them. And in these choices, I find a freedom I never imagined would be mine. Freedom not from hardship, but from betrayal by myself. I think about the younger women I once was, the eager, hopeful, cautious, fearful versions of me. I want to tell them that it's okay to demand more. It's okay to want fully and honestly. It's okay to refuse to disappear. You can be strong and emotional, ambitious and tender, patient and bold. Do not let the world or the voices inside you tell you otherwise. I do not claim perfection. I still stumble. I still feel the echoes of years spent in quiet, compliant endurance. But now, when I feel those echoes, I name them and release them. I live with awareness, choice, and permission. The emotional trap no longer defines me. I am the one who decides how to respond, how to feel, and how to continue. And as I sit here now, the sunlight warm on my face, I feel something I never thought I would. Peace. Not the false calm of compliance. Not the dull comfort of unspoken endurance. Real peace. Peace that comes from facing yourself honestly, claiming your own worth, and finally, after a lifetime, giving yourself permission to exist fully. The truth is simple. The emotional trap is everywhere. But it does not have to hold you forever. You can recognize it. You can step away. You can reclaim yourself, no matter your age. And when you do, life in all its messy, unpredictable, beautiful reality becomes yours to truly live.